All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to just wait a minute or so to let people get logged on. And then in the meantime, you can just chat who you are so we know who's in the room, so to speak. So tell us your name, your grade level, what your role is, and just give us a hello. All right. Oh, I see a bunch of people already logged on. So we are going to get started. For those of you who just logged on, we've asked you to chat who you are and what you teach or what your role is so we know who's in the room. Good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope you are all healthy and practicing self-care. We're very excited to be here to host our first seminar on supporting ELLs during this distance learning time. My name is Nicole Knight. I am the Executive Director of the ELLMA office, and I'm joined by three of my colleagues. I'm going to pass it on to James to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, I'm James Kindle. I am an elementary language specialist and I do a lot of our work with elementary newcomer students. I'll pass it over to Rita.
Hi, I'm Rita Pope. I'm also an elementary specialist in ELLMA, and I'm going to be looking at the chat today and trying to answer questions during the presentation. And I see folks from all different levels, so teachers in elementary, secondary, I see adult ed here, so welcome all of you. I'll pass it on to Lubia.
Hi, I'm Lubia Sanchez. Buenos dias. I support dual language and early exit bilingual schools, and I'm the multilingual pathways coordinator. Good to be with you today.
All right, before we jump in, I just want to acknowledge what I know is on everyone's mind, just how daunting this work is, especially as we think about moving towards distance learning for our English language learners. We are seeing in real time how the shelter in place is highlighting and deepening the very real equity issues in our community. We know that many of our immigrant families are among those most likely to have lost a job and among those least likely to receive benefits such as unemployment or the federal stimulus bill. Many of our students live in crowded multifamily households and do not have access to devices or internet. So as we jump into a discussion about an instructional framework and lesson design, we don't want to minimize or dismiss these challenges. At the same time, we don't want to feel paralyzed. We want to focus what is under our control and within our sphere of influence while continuing the hard and important work of supporting our families address the many barriers to learning through our work as a full service community school district. So then the other thing I'll say is that we are going to be looking at this work at a pretty high level. So we'll be asking you at the end where you would like to go deeper. And we're definitely happy to support you individually or in small groups or through follow-up seminars around specific topics or folks in very specific contexts. All right, so let's take a look at what we'll cover today. We are going to walk through our 5 essential practices for ELL achievement, which we've adapted to the distance learning context. We will look at how these play out in a model lesson taught by the lovely and talented Maestra Sanchez. And we will share some resources and tools aligned to the essential practices. Taking a tip by Sam Solomon, who many of you have met, I have our tiny URL link at the bottom of this slide and all of our slides where you can find the slide deck, as well as this link right here to the essential practices document. We want to encourage you to follow along. It'll be easier to kind of see what's going on if you have that open somewhere. And with that, let's move to introduction to our essential practices. So much of ELLMA's work over the last 5 or 6 years has been grounded in these research-based essential practices. We consider them important for all learners, but absolutely critical, absolutely essential for our language learners to grow and thrive. And as we grappled with how to provide you all some guidance during distance learning, we realized that these same practices can be applied with some tweaking, adaptations, and a lot of patience and grace. So with that, I'm going to pass it to James, who's going to go over the first 3 practices.
Great, so it's great to be here with you all. And so we're going to start with our first essential practice, which is access and rigor. And if you want to click Nicole, when we think about for students in the same way that if we had their students in our classroom, that we want to have a high challenge and high support environment for our students, we want to try to maintain those same both high standards for students as well as adequate supports for them in a distance learning context. So go to the next slide. And so you'll see here our essential practice Google Doc has been screenshotted for you. If you do go to that tiny URL, it's hyperlinked on all featured slides. So if you want to access the actual Google Doc itself, you can do so either by clicking on slide 2 or on any of the slides that show it. So the first thing that we want to think about when we think about access and rigor for our ELLs is what online tools can we use to help make the content and the instructions comprehensible for students. We really encourage you to pick a platform, whether it's something like a Seesaw or Google Classroom, and focus on getting students really used to using that platform, starting with some non-academic tasks to familiarize them with the process as well as sort of the structure of that platform, and helping them so that before you move into that sort of more cognitive load that they're going to face when they have academic and content subjects. So as Nicole stated earlier, we're going to be seeing some lesson examples from Maestra Sanchez. And so in our webinar today, she's going to first start with an example. This is going to show a video that she's showing to students, directing them to use Google Doc, which is a tool that the students are familiar with doing from utilizing it in her classroom. So we'll take a look at what that looks like here.
Hello, students. It's good to see you again. I hope that you're all doing very well. I miss you a lot. But today what we're going to do is we're going to think about the difference between a retelling and a summary. Now remember, we did this work a while ago, and maybe 2 units ago, and we worked really hard to make sure that our summaries were very, very succinct and also clear. And so let's go back to the anchor chart we used in our classroom. Give me 1 second to pull that up. If you remember this anchor chart, this poster was standing on the left side of our room. And so you also have this in your Google Doc. So I'm going to start looking at that first bullet. It says, retells the whole story, right? And in a summary, it tells only the most important parts of the story. So one important difference is that a retell gives you a lot of information from the beginning to the end, and probably it's like really big. And a summary is only telling us the most important. So you see that it's not like this, it's like this. It's making a decision about what are the most important parts of the story. Now, for this next part, I want you to read each of the bullets. So it's on the retell side, you're going to read 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then you're going to read the bullets on the summary side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're going to think about this, and you're going to tell me when we have our meeting next Thursday, you're going to tell me what are 2 more differences between a retelling and a summary. And I know that you probably already know this, but I want us to remember so that we are ready to do very good writing together in the next day. Okay, I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. This is Lubia. So I'm going to share a little bit about my thinking on that. As the question was, how do we make the content and instructions comprehensible? I really thought about, particularly to our ELs, I thought specifically about 3 things. I thought about consistency, about building upon their prior knowledge or things that we had already studied in class before layering new information, and then presenting the information in a really calm and warm tone. You'll notice that the retelling is something that I had already taught them, and so we were thinking about the differences between the retell and summary. And then secondly, I really tried to integrate those visuals that I know they had seen because they were up in my class, and pointing that out to provide that kind of safety around, like, oh yeah, I've seen this already. This is a consistent practice or poster or visual. And then finally, I was very attentive to my pace, because this is obviously a very stressful time for everyone, particularly for our English learners. And so I wanted to really help them feel warm, help them feel invited, and also safe, knowing that that context right now is, you know, it's a hit or miss. Maybe some people are fine with this, but maybe many of ours are having a lot of stress. And so I wanted to create ease for them during that lesson. So that's what I thought about when thinking of, like, how do I make this content and instructions comprehensible for kids?
Thank you, Maestra Sanchez. And so we're going to talk about another key element when it comes to access and rigor, and that's the idea of providing scaffolded access to complex text. And so really we can break down those scaffolds into three main groups. First is thinking about before reading. How can we connect students to their existing schema to prime them for what they're about to read? During reading, how can we support students to make meaning of the text as they read? And after reading, how can we give students avenues to consolidate their new knowledge after they get done with reading the complex text? So I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Maestra Sanchez, again, and she's going to show an example of how that flow might look with your students.
Okay, folks, and so I chose to use a 5th grade text from Unit 8 in Adelante and Advance, which is a curriculum used in dual language. So I use the Google Doc because that's what kids are used to in my classroom. And so, as always, before reading, I want to anchor in what the intended learning is. So the objectives are there for students. In this particular lesson or sequence of lessons, they'll be thinking about this legend and also the key events and how to use sequence language to summarize. So if you scroll down, for the actual, this is good, for the actual before reading, I focused on doing a picture walk. And because in this curriculum, there's a opening video that kind of presents the language that students will be using, and also the essential questions, I figured, okay, those key ideas are already there. I'm going to focus on them really making a connection to these images to think about this cultural group and what their life or their context look like. And so if you scroll down a little bit, I also put in there the embedded language support. Now we know that every classroom is different and that we often have a range of English learners. So we might have students at the beginning stages and also maybe some ELLs. Regardless, I'm going to err on the side of being careful and putting in support, but always reminding students that it's a choice. So that they may employ, right? So they can use the bulleted choices there, or they can write their own. But I want to kind of set that expectation that, again, this is something that we often use in class, the sentence starters and what we call a drafting template to think about language choices. And so then students would write their responses in that little section. Okie dokie. And so then to do the during reading, I put in a couple, again, I anchored myself in this idea that I don't know who's out, you know, there's a range of students in my class, and I want to provide choices for students. I want them to think about what do they need, right? And so in the reading, they can listen to the audio. I used an app to record myself with that audio. And then also I put in a link of the actual screenshots of the text, so they can make that decision. Do I listen? Do I read it myself? Or do I read it with someone in my home? Maybe I do all three. Again, helping students realize that there are choices to make for their own learning. And then finally, next, we put in some text-dependent questions. Just, you know, not a lot, just about 5 that really would help them in that summary of important key events. Okay. And they would just type in their responses there. And then, oh, could you scroll a little bit back up, Nicole? Thank you. Right there for the after reading. Oh, I'm sorry. So then actually there's the note catcher where they are using, again, similar structure, consistent structure. They're looking at what is my language support that I might use, right? And so they would write their responses there. Again, the language support is focused on sequence language. Okay, can we scroll down a little bit more? And then here they would revisit the retell and summary, which is the video we saw earlier. Keep scrolling down. And then I put in there that they would have a small group meeting with me, their teacher, and the time and date would be there. So again, this is following that potential flow of the lesson. I would remind them here, and this is, at this meeting, I would kind of be listening for the use of language that I had shared with them earlier, that sequence language. So I would be using this time to make sure that the content is being understood, but also that they're applying the language. And then finally, if you scroll down a little bit more, this is the actual summary template. So taking it from just the note catcher to an actual more paragraph structure or longer piece of writing. Again, you'll see that there are, the drafting template is my same tool, and that we're focusing on what are the choices. Now here, I would tell students to make a decision. Like, you said it one way in the earlier step, but here, try to use different language. Try to use a different way of saying the same thing, even though there's obviously a connection between the body of this summary paragraph and the retelling we had earlier. So can we scroll down a little bit more? And then as kind of the culminating task, if you will, is they would send to me an audio or video recording of their summary. And so in that way, there's kind of another opportunity for me to hear how they're applying and working with the language. Okie dokie.
So thank you for walking us through that example, Maestro Sanchez, we appreciate it. So as we saw, this was just one example of how you might structure this flow and incorporate these scaffolds using a Google Doc. But the important thing really is just to be thinking about these before, during, and after stages of scaffolding when it comes to complex text, and how you could adapt them to whatever platform you're utilizing or whatever sort of structure you have set up with your students. With before reading, you're thinking about how can I ensure students have access to the text, whether it's via pictures, translations, cueing questions, etc. If we look at the next slide, for during reading, how can we chunk the text for students to make it manageable? What text-dependent questions can we ask? Can we provide audio support or graphic organizers to help them with their thinking? And on the next slide, with after reading, how can students respond orally or in writing to consolidate their thinking? Perhaps could they do it in their home language? Could they take a picture of their work? These are all the different things to be thinking about in a ways that might make it most useful for your context. So we're going to move on to our second essential practice, which is thinking about integrated and designated ELD. So we want to make sure that language is still being supported for our ELLs, and they still have the opportunity to build their English skills in reading, math, science, and whatever context or other subject area they might be learning in. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we still have that protected designated ELD time. So that should be time where our students are focusing in on ELD standards and where they're still building those language skills that they need. So go to the next slide. So how do we do this? So one aspect that we want to be sure to be thinking about is by providing explicit language instruction for students. So on the next slide, one piece of this is by having our daily content language objective, and really I wanted to call out that language piece of that. We saw in Lubia's example that she had students recounting the key events in writing, but she included that piece of language, that using sequencing language that you see right there, to really make sure and make explicit to students the type of language she wants to be hearing them utilize and what's going to be in focus. And we also saw Lubia providing some different sentence frames and providing different other tools, whether it's like things like word banks or word boxes. You'll see on this bottom bullet in the slides, this link to the language resources. That's going to provide a lot of different resources for you around sentence frames, other tools you can utilize with students that will be helpful for them in doing this work. Go to the next slide. Second element to think about when it comes to designated and integrated ELD is how are we providing regular opportunities for students to talk, have discussions, and write. These can take two primary forms. The first is synchronous. So that's when you're trying to do it with students all live working together through something like a Google Meet or a Zoom. Or it could take place asynchronously. So that means that students can kind of do it on their own schedule, respond to each other verbally or in writing, whenever it kind of works for them or they have access to their device. We'll go to the next slide. So one of the biggest concerns that we think about in terms of what our English language learners are potentially losing when it comes to distance learning is that they're potentially losing that vital opportunity to be around and communicating with fluent English-speaking peers. And so we know that unless our ELLs have the opportunity to practice and produce that language, they won't develop those skills. And so rather than setting them up just to be passive learners, an environment where they're just doing a lot of maybe just reading or doing things like that, we really want to make sure that we're incorporating into all of our lessons opportunities for students to make meaning and use language, whether it's in a written format or a verbal format. And so we have some examples that are listed here. These are a lot of different tools where students are either going to record themselves. You see the example Flipgrid, for example, is a really great tool that students might utilize. But other ones, if you utilize a Google Classroom, there's a lot of opportunities for students to write and comment on each other's work and utilize that tool. Go to the next slide. And the last piece that we want to talk about is our designated ELD time. And so when we think about designated ELD, we're thinking about who are the students who are going to need the most guidance and support in using language. And so one group that likely comes to mind for us during when we think about that is our newcomer students. And so on the next slide is thinking about how can we provide some times for doing those like one-on-one check-ins or small group work with our students. So really trying to prioritize your students and for example, for your newcomer students, are there times where you can check in on them specifically? Or Lubia mentioned doing like a small group on a Thursday for her class of students to do like a check-in with them around language. And then on the next slide, we also really encourage students to continue to utilize digital language learning platforms that are available. So if your students had already been utilizing Rosetta Stone or Imagine Learning as part of their learning, we recommend that those are continued to be used for students. Those platforms have been set up where students should be able to keep utilizing them at home as long as they have access to a device. Duolingo is an app that's available for anybody to utilize for free for them to work on their language skills. I'm utilizing it to work on my Portuguese, so that's available for any students to utilize as well. And then that top link, BrainPop ELL, that's another great resource for students, and they should have access to it via Clever. Has really highly structured sort of grammatical sequence to it. It has repeated vocabulary exposure and practice. And so this can be especially valuable for our newcomer students. And so we're going to move into our third essential practice, which is data-driven decisions. And so we're thinking about basing our instruction off of our students' need and thinking about how can we give them feedback in a distance learning environment. So on the next slide, the first thing we want to do is really make sure that we're utilizing the data we have about students in order to guide our support. And a great way to do that is utilize the teacher-facing ELL progress monitoring dashboard. Some of you might already be familiar with this tool. If you're not, we definitely recommend checking it out. It's linked here. This is a tool where you can find information about students' most recent LPAC levels. You can find information about students' SRI scores, home languages, and more. And so there's a lot of different tools that you can utilize there to help you in thinking about who might you need to prioritize for things like one-on-one check-ins and so forth, or how can you maybe differentiate instructions, pair students who share a home language and so forth. And then the next slide. The second piece when we think about database decisions is really how do we give students feedback around content and language. we want to make sure that we're not giving overly corrective feedback to students and really just focusing in on just what are the areas of focus that we've outlined within our language objectives, or what is our target language for students. Some of the tools you'll see linked here or in the next slide are things like quizzes and Kahoot. And those are tools that students can utilize where you can give immediate feedback to students. So I'm going to hand it back over to my colleague, Maestra Sanchez, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the considerations that she has when she is thinking about ways to provide feedback to students.
So I actually just thought about a specific meeting time or two where I would really ask, link all of those conversations or those talks back to the content and language objective, which, if you remember, was being able to summarize using that sequence language. So when I'm having the meetings, I'm listening, like, are they actually using it and applying it at that time? And if I notice that they're not, I might create like a little quiz to have them focus a little bit on the form or the organization of the grammar. If I hear that, I would make some little quiz for them at that time. How will I give feedback in a clear, positive way? I'm trying to not focus so much on the corrective, but providing the opportunity for the practice if I hear it being misused, or if I read it being misused. And again, the follow-up task that I chose specifically was I was like, I'm not going to see them. There's going to be very, very little opportunity for me to do that informally. So I need to push them to audio record or video record so that I have a real opportunity to hear how they're applying both the content and language. So those are some thoughts. Those three are my thought bubbles for what, as a lesson designer, what I'm thinking about along the way, right?
I love that Lubia brought up the ways that she's thinking about how to give feedback to students. Also be thinking about the ways that students can give feedback to each other. The Google Docs and Google Classroom has a lot of great opportunities for students to collaborate. There are also a lot of the different tools that we've already shown, like Flipgrid and so forth. There's ways for students to give feedback to each other as well.
Okay, we're going to pause here for to look at some of the questions you've been asking. And before I ask a few of those and we give some answers together, I wanted to remind you that you can use the Q&A button if you have specific questions. Some of you have been doing that. Thank you. And there's lots going on in the chat right now as well. Also, we invite you to use the chat button to share any strategies or tools that you've used for instruction for your English language learners during this time. That would be great to see that all together. So looking at a question that just popped up, Kelleth, this might be for you, but it said most of the kids we distributed Chromebooks were English language learners. Support for these will be done by students and parents. Asking parents to access the camera on the Chromebook, for example, is a lesson in itself. Will there be a district version of a Chromebook 101, or is that something we should provide as a site in Spanish, Arabic, etc.?
I think that's a great idea. So I'm going to get to work on that and talk to the tech department to see if we can work on that along with translations for English language learners. So thank you for the suggestion.
Great. And then the other question, if there was one thing that I wanted to institute as a teacher for my newcomers, what might it be? James?
So I would say if the main thing for your newcomer students is going to be especially doing some of those one-on-one check-ins and individual sort of reaching out for students, and then getting them really set up on whether it's Seesaw or on Google Classroom, because for them it's going to be a lot of work just getting them really used to that format and that setup for students. Once they're familiar with it, if you're at a school that has Imagine Learning has been a really great tool for our newcomers to utilize, because it's very directive for them to use. Otherwise, BrainPop ELL is something I would definitely recommend checking out and sharing with students and families.
Great, and with that, I'm going to send it back.
All right, thank you everyone. So we're going to continue on with our last two essential practices. So the fourth one is taking an asset-based approach This is extremely important right now, especially important as we situate learning in the home. So it's a really good time to remember a couple of things. One is that our students' language and culture are not deficits or barriers. On the contrary, they are tremendous assets to their learning. We just have to figure out what it looks like to leverage that during this time. And we'll be talking about that in a moment. And the second is to remember this notion of funds of knowledge that some of you may have heard about, read about in your pre-service or professional development. And so this idea of funds of knowledge, so funds is the idea of wealth, right? So thinking about the wealth of knowledge, skills, and practices that are part of family culture, values, and ways of being and living. So this can be anything from oral storytelling and song to everyday chores such as cooking, caring for family, skills that live within our families such as gardening. Think about how many of our families, especially as many of our recent immigrants, are coming from agricultural or rural cultures. Thinking about crafts that are traditions or skills such as weaving and sewing. And so we should be asking ourselves, how are we leveraging this wealth and making space for students to learn within their family environment, which, by the way, also provides opportunity to get off the screen and to be with family. So a couple of ideas here. One is to encourage students to read and learn in their own language and with their family. So just to remember that the learning that students will do, the content learning, if they have an opportunity to learn in that home language, it will transfer to English. So giving them the space, giving them the permission, giving yourselves the permission to do that. And literacy as well. Sometimes there's, it might seem counterintuitive that focusing time reading and writing in one's home language will take away from English time. And on the contrary, building those literacy skills in one's home language is going to transfer. It's going to give them a strong literacy base. So students can be asked to read with a parent, a grandparent, read to a younger sibling. And then secondly, consider those activities that can be done with family members, like writing and illustrating family stories or family recipes. There's a couple links on that last one. This link here that I'm pointing to with my mouse is from Scholastic, so really appropriate for elementary students. And then here, or if you click on this screen here, is an example from that I found from NPR, where or KQED, where students, secondary students are sharing a family recipe and a story that connects to it. So really beautiful, and may provide some exemplars for what you may, you can share with students what they may produce. So the next thing is particularly for those of you who are teaching in dual language and bilingual programs, you may be asking yourselves, how do I manage this? And so the big thing, to the extent possible, understanding that there are layers of complexity to this, you want to align your instruction to your regular language allocation. So for example, if you teach in a dual language class, if you're a kinder teacher in a 90-10 model, then you want to try and provide instruction and engagement that is 90% Spanish and 10% English. And there are a wealth of resources you may have already engaged in here that the multilingual team has set up for you. Here are some examples of complex texts. And then down here, you'll see this tiny URL. Our multilingual specialists have set up office hours to support you further in that work. And to take it to the finish line, this is, I know, what is on everyone's mind. Our last essential practice is focusing on the whole child. So, you know, as we discussed in the very opening of this webinar, we have all seen how the pandemic is both surfacing and exacerbating the systemic barriers to quality education and adding new layers to stress for families. So we do not pretend that we have the answers for everything, but just want to offer 3 considerations. The first is to plan by anticipating the very real barriers to student engagement. So really focusing on flexibility, as much asynchronous learning as possible, while making those, check-ins for small groups or one-on-one, but having the least amount of time possible in those whole group Zoom lessons that might not work in terms of kids' schedules, and giving them lots of time to complete assignments. So we're talking about, a week-long task, or even every other week, and thinking about those more project-based tasks that students can work on over time. The second thing here is to include some wellness checks. OEA has put together some great guidance. There's a little YouTube video that's really helpful, as well as a tracker. So you can hear how some of your fellow teachers have been using wellness checks. And then finally, many of you are familiar with Talking Points. We're a big fan. This is a text message app that automatically translates to like over 100 languages. So it will translate to the language that is on record at home and then translate back to you in English. So there's a link to a webinar, and if you don't have access to this, or do but don't know how to use it, you can reach out to Kelly. Hope Kelly is okay with that. And then secondly, we want to encourage you to learn about and share the resources most relevant to your community. So just remembering that you are not in this alone. We are here to support you. There are many partners within and outside OUSD. So one way, just resource we want to make sure you're aware of, if you press our beautiful butterfly poster, it'll take you to our Sanctuary website. Here we're curating resources that specifically speak to our immigrant families, and we will continue to update them. So they have, there's resources for families who may be facing threat of eviction, to health needs, immigrant rights. Want to point this out, we do have in the ELLMA office in our refugee asylee programs, community navigators who can provide translation and interpretation in minority languages, including MUM. One of the questions we're getting most of is how do we provide interpretation to our MUM families. So please check that out and request support as you need it. And finally, our last consideration for attending the needs of the whole child is to try and incorporate some fun, right? We know that this is a really stressful time, so there are lots of online and offline ways that you can incorporate some fun and mindfulness and just ways to de-stress. So we have a couple of our favorites here, and we'll keep adding them to them. I just discovered and love this Go Noodle. It's super silly and fun, gets kids up and dancing, yoga for kids, and also just remembering from a language learning lens, these are great activities to engage students in informal and stress-free language learning. Even be a part of your designated ELD time, right? It's okay to have fun and learn language at the same time. So wanted to end with that, and before we move to our closing and taking more Q&A, one, I would just want to reiterate that we know nothing can replace the in-person teaching and learning experience, the relationships that you have with students, and that socially mediated learning that we know is critical for all learners, and especially for English language learners. But we also believe that we can keep our students engaged, learning and growing in new ways until we get on the other side of this, which we're all looking forward to. So with that, we are going to take some questions, and actually before we do, I'm going to invite Kelleth, who is going to share a poll that we have made for you, so we can hear from you what you want to learn more about to be able to craft some follow-up sessions for you. Kelleth?
And just launched that poll right now, so feel free to click on the polling and check out the poll and let us know how ELLMA can support you in following up with further resources.
Yeah, so that first option, lesson design for ELLs, Maestra Sanchez showed one way of designing a lesson. So one thing we were thinking about was to, Maestra can kind of go a little bit more slowly with you and unpack the parts of the lesson, and then allow you to apply the lesson template and flow to your own context, and maybe introduce a couple other lesson designs. I think the other things are maybe more self-explanatory. So please let us know what you're thinking, and in the meantime, we'll kind of share the results of that in a moment. I'll turn it over to Rita again to lead us through some Q&A or maybe call out some of the comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to, this has come up a lot. So maybe Nicole, if you can scroll to the very beginning so people can see the actual document, but there's a lot of questions around how do we gain access to the presentation and the links. And the presentation is at the tinyurl.com/distance learning for ELLs, which is at the bottom of every slide. But if you want easier access to the link, it's actually in the document, which if you go to the very first page of content, there we go, where it says 5 English language learner essential practices. If you click on there, you'll get a 2-page document. It has all the links from the presentation in there. So that was the question we got the most. I have a question.
Sorry, I just wanted to,
go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, please, we encourage you to bookmark that because we will be, you know, we're all learning and we continue to curate. And so we will continue to, you know, add information to that document.
Let's see. So here's a question that I'm going to ask the group, but we can also refer to the literacy department. Does anyone know about resources provided by Collaborative Classroom for the SIPS instruction?
I'm not aware, but we will definitely follow up and add that to Teachers Central or to our document.
Okay, I'm getting an answer from Erin in the literacy department, Erin Kogan, and she says yes. So I will type that into the response for that question. There's also a question around inside the USA, and I think James might know this the best. Are publishers making textbooks available in digital format?
So yeah, for Inside the USA, I'm not sure if National Geographic has those available for students, but I can check with the Cengage representative and find out and follow up with that person.
Okay, great. There's been a lot of really positive feedback about the presentation, and I'm trying to see if there's some more questions in the chat. Questions about some of these things being free to us. I think all the links we put in are free right now to OUSD. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think that might be it. Yeah, there's some good ideas in the chat though. So if you haven't gone in, I recommend panelists to go ahead and do that. And we will also save these what's in the chat and the Q&A, and it will be part of the presentation. So back to you.
Thank you, Rita. Khalith, you want to show us, okay, where we're at? So does the red mean anything on that ELL specific apps? No.
I believe that's the top vote.
Oh, I see. Okay. Great. So we have ELL specific apps and games. So yeah, we can work on that. We might be working with Khalith and others who have maybe more expertise than we do, but we're learning too, as well as lesson design. So we will, and newcomer specific strategies, those are all coming up. So we will definitely be in touch through our ELLMA newsletters, through Teacher Central, around opportunities. We are also working on building out, there's a Google site page now for distance learning for ELLs, and we will build out much of what we shared here, make sure that you have access to easy to follow Google Docs and Google Drive folders. So we're building and learning, and we invite you to share with us. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you're willing to share what you're learning or finding yourself, as well as support that you need. So, here you can find easy links to our emails and where to find some resources. Notice I also included a See Here for interpretation for MUM and other minority languages that we know has been a big question. So we look forward to working with you and collaborating with you and learning with you in this difficult time. Is there any other closing remarks from my colleagues?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all that you're doing for students and for keeping ELLs at the center of your work. We really appreciate it.
And please do contact us with any questions. We're happy to support.
Okay, have a great rest of the day and week, everyone. We're logging off.
Take care.
Adios.
Thanks, everybody.